You can always tell who a man is by what he does when no one's watching. The coffee had already gone cold by the time the glass hit the floor. It wasn't loud enough to stop the room, but sharp enough to make a few heads turn, just for a second, just long enough to notice something was off, and then look away again. Late afternoon lights spilled through the cafe windows, stretching across polished wood tables and half-finished lattes, catching in the quiet places people preferred to keep untouched. Conversations softened, not out of concern, but out of habit. Nobody wanted to be the one who got involved. At the far side of the room, near the window where the sunlight fell just a little too bright, a woman stood still beside her chair, one hand resting lightly on the table, the other hanging by her side, composed but not comfortable. The man in front of her leaned too close, not aggressive, not loud, just enough to shift the air around her in a way that made it harder to breathe. He spoke with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind that asked questions no one wanted to answer. She didn't respond right away. Just watched him, measured him, waited. Most people didn't notice that part. Most people never did. A few feet away, at a table no one paid attention to, Marcus Reed sat with his back half turned to the room, a paper cup between his hands, his jacket folded neatly over the back of his chair. Across from him, a small boy leaned over a worksheet, tongue pressed lightly against his lip as he traced letters that didn't always stay inside the lines. Marcus didn't interrupt him, didn't correct him, just watched. The kind of watching that didn't rush anything. The kind that made space instead of filling it. He heard the glass. Everyone did. But he was one of the few who didn't look away. His eyes lifted, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to take in the shape of the moment. The man. The distance. The way the woman's shoulders held steady, even when the space around her didn't. Marcus didn't move right away. He looked back down at the paper in front of his son. A crooked R. He reached over, turned the page slightly so the boy wouldn't have to adjust. His wrist. Try it again, he said quietly. The boy nodded, focused, safe. That was when Marcus stood. No rush. No announcement. Just a chair sliding back against the floor, soft enough that no one turned. He stepped forward, not toward the man, not toward the woman, but into the space between them like it had always been his place to stand. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't square his shoulders. Didn't make it a scene. "Ma'am," he said, calm, steady, as if asking a simple question, "Are you all right?" The man paused, not because he felt threatened, but because something in the tone didn't invite escalation. It didn't challenge. It didn't submit. It simply existed. The kind of presence that didn't need permission. The room shifted. Slightly. Subtly. Enough to be felt, not named. Marcus didn't look at the man. Not yet. His attention stayed where it mattered. The woman's eyes met his for the first time, and in that brief second, something passed between them. Not relief. Not gratitude. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe, that he wasn't there to prove anything. Just to make sure she didn't have to stand alone. The man exhaled through his nose, muttered something under his breath, and stepped back just enough to reclaim his own space. Not defeated. Just done. Marcus nodded once, barely noticeable, then turned away like nothing had happened. Like it wasn't something to be held on to. By the time he reached his table, the boy had already finished another letter, proud of the shape even if it leaned too far to the left. Marcus sat down, picked up his cup, and took a sip without reacting to the cold. "That's better," he said, tapping the page lightly. Across the room, the woman remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, watching him in a way she didn't quite understand yet. Not because of what he did, but because of how easily he returned to being just a father, like that was always the most important thing in the room. The chair across from Marcus stayed empty for a moment, the kind of empty that feels intentional, like the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next. He did not look up right away. He rarely did. His son, Caleb, had moved on to the next line, pressing his pencil harder now, each letter a little more confident, a little less unsure. Marcus adjusted the napkin under the worksheet so it would not slide. Small things. Always the small things first. It was only when the shadow reached the edge of the table that he noticed her again. Not because she demanded attention, but because she did not. She stood there for a second, composed, measured, as if deciding whether this moment deserved to exist or be forgotten like everything else that had almost happened in that room. "May I?" she asked, her voice even, controlled, the kind that had been trained to never reveal more than necessary. Marcus glanced up, then nodded once, not out of politeness, but acknowledgement. She sat down across from him, careful not to disturb the paper, the cup, the rhythm that had already been set. Caleb looked up, curious, eyes moving between the two adults with the quiet honesty only children carry. "Hi," he said simply. She paused, just long enough to let the word settle. "Hello," she replied, softer than before, as if something in the room required a different tone now. Marcus leaned back slightly, giving space without making it obvious. "You did not have to do that," she said after a moment, her gaze steady but not demanding. He picked up his cup again, turned it slightly in his hands before answering. "I know. That was all. No explanation. No justification. Just the truth, placed gently between them." She studied him then, not his clothes, not the worn edges of his jacket or the way his hands carried the marks of long days, but the absence of something she had grown used to seeing in men who stepped in. There was no expectation. No need to be seen. Caleb tugged lightly at Marcus's sleeve. "Dad, is this right?" Marcus leaned forward again, attention shifting instantly, completely. "Let me see." He traced the line with his finger, not correcting, just guiding. "You are close. Try slowing down." Caleb nodded, erasing carefully, trying again. The woman watched that too. Not the words. The patience. The way Marcus did not rush him, did not fill the silence with instructions, just stayed present until the boy found his own way forward. "He is good," she said quietly. Marcus did not look up this time. "He is learning." Another pause. The kind that did not feel empty. Outside, a car passed, tires brushing against the street with a soft, steady sound. Inside, the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, conversations picking back up, cups being lifted, chairs shifting slightly against the floor. Life continuing, as if nothing had changed. But something had. She reached into her bag, then stopped. Her hand rested there for a second before she pulled it back out empty. Not everything needed to be solved with an exchange. Not everything needed a price. "Thank you," she said instead, and this time it sounded different. Not automatic. Not practiced. Marcus nodded once, still focused on the page in front of him. "You are welcome." She hesitated, just briefly, then added, "Most people looked away." Marcus finally glanced up, meeting her eyes again, calm, steady. "Most people have reasons." She held his gaze, searching for something. Maybe an answer, maybe a flaw. "And you?" Marcus leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. "I have a son." Caleb looked up at that, smiling without fully understanding why. The woman exhaled softly, something in her posture loosening, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. She stood then, smoothing the edge of her coat, not in a hurry, not lingering either. "Your son is lucky," she said, the words landing softer than she expected. Marcus looked at Caleb, then back at her. "So am I." She nodded once, then turned toward the door. Just before she stepped out, she glanced back. Marcus was already back where he had been, one hand resting near the paper, the other holding the cup, as if the moment had folded itself neatly into something that did not need to be remembered. That was the part she could not quite understand, and the part she knew she would not forget. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft chime as it closed behind her, a sound that blended into the street noise without asking to be remembered, but she noticed it anyway. Eleanor Whitmore did not usually notice small sounds. Her days were filled with louder things, decisions that moved markets, conversations that carried weight, rooms that shifted when she entered them. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon air felt different against her skin, lighter somehow, as if something had been set down without her realizing she had been carrying it. She paused near the curb, one hand resting briefly against the cool metal of a parking meter, her gaze drifting back toward the cafe window. Inside, Marcus Reed sat exactly where she had left him, his posture unchanged, his attention fully returned to the boy across from him. There was no glance toward the door, no checking to see if she was still there, no lingering curiosity. The moment had already passed for him. That was what unsettled her. Not his presence, but his absence of need. A black sedan waited at the corner, engine running, its polished surface catching the fading sunlight. The driver stood beside it, posture straight, eyes alert but respectful, the kind of man trained to anticipate before being asked. He opened the rear door as soon as he saw her approach. "Ma'am," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded once and slid into the back seat, the leather cool and familiar beneath her. The door closed with a soft, final sound. Inside, everything was controlled again. Quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet that belonged to power, not peace. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic with smooth precision. Eleanor did not reach for her phone. It sat beside her, screen dark, notifications waiting, the world ready to remind her who she was supposed to be. Instead, she looked out the window as the cafe disappeared behind them, shrinking into just another building on a street filled with places people forgot. "Do you need to head straight to the office?" the driver asked after a moment, his voice careful, measured. She did not answer right away. Her eyes followed the reflection of passing storefronts, each one sliding across the glass like a memory she had not decided whether to keep. "No," she said finally. "Take the longer route." The driver nodded once. No questions. The city stretched out around them, familiar but distant, like something she had learned how to navigate but never truly belonged to. Her mind returned, not to the moment itself, but to the way it ended. The way he had said, "So am I." Not defensive, not proud, just certain. She had heard confidence before. It usually came with edges, with something to prove. But that had not. It had been quiet, grounded, complete. She leaned back slightly, her fingers resting against the edge of the seat, feeling the subtle vibration of the road beneath them. For years, she had built a life where everything had a purpose, a cost, a measurable return. People approached her with intent. They wanted something. They always did. Access, approval, opportunity, even gratitude, when it came, often carried weight, as if it needed to be exchanged for something else later. But that man in the cafe had taken nothing from her. Not her name, not her status, not even the moment itself. He had stepped in, and then stepped back out, as if it had never been about him at all. The car slowed at a red light. A group of pedestrians crossed in front of them, laughing, talking, unaware of the world inside the tinted glass just a few feet away. Eleanor watched them, but her thoughts stayed somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Most people have reasons. His words returned, simple and unguarded. She had spent years understanding reasons, analyzing them, using them. But his had been different. Not calculated. Not strategic. Just human. The light turned green. The car moved forward again. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief second, not out of fatigue, but to hold on to something she could not yet define. When she opened them, her reflection stared back at her from the window, composed, precise, exactly who the world expected her to be. But beneath that, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for her to feel it. And for the first time in a long while, she did not reach to correct it. The city moved on without asking her permission, traffic flowing in steady lines, signals changing with mechanical certainty, people stepping forward when they were told and stopping when they had to. But inside the car, time stretched in a quieter way, less structured, less predictable, and Eleanor Whitmore found herself watching it all as if she had been placed just slightly outside of it, not removed, but no longer entirely inside either, her hand resting lightly against the window as buildings passed in reflection, each one familiar, each one part of a life she had built with precision, discipline, and a kind of distance that had once felt necessary but now felt noticeable, and she could not quite explain why that difference mattered, only that it did. The driver adjusted slightly in his seat, checking the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second before returning his focus to the road. "Traffic is lighter on this route," he said, more as an update than a conversation, and she nodded even though he could not see it, her attention still somewhere else, somewhere between the cafe and this moment, somewhere between who she was and something she had not yet named. She thought about the way Marcus had stood, not stepping forward to dominate the space, not stepping back to avoid it, just existing in that narrow line where presence alone was enough, and it unsettled her in a way that boardroom negotiations never had, because there had been nothing to negotiate, nothing to gain, nothing to leverage, just a decision made without calculation, and that kind of decision did not fit into the system she understood. The car turned onto a quieter street, the noise softening slightly, and she closed her eyes again for a brief second, not to escape, but to hold on to the feeling before it faded into something easier to ignore. When she opened them, the city was still there, unchanged, but her attention shifted inward, tracing back through the layers she had built over time. The expectations, the control, the constant awareness of how she was perceived, all of it still intact, still functioning. But now carrying the faintest crack, not visible, not dangerous, just enough to let something unfamiliar in. And she did not push it out. Not yet. Back at the cafe, Marcus had finished his coffee without noticing when it had gone cold. Or maybe he had noticed and chosen not to care. Caleb packed his worksheet carefully into a worn folder, edges slightly bent but protected, the way Marcus handled most things in their life, not perfect, but steady. Are we going home now? Caleb asked, swinging his feet slightly under the chair. Marcus checked his watch, a simple one, scratched along the edge but still ticking with quiet reliability. We have time, he said, standing and reaching for his jacket. Let us stop by the store first. Caleb nodded, already thinking about the small choices that came with that, cereal or pancakes, apples or oranges, simple decisions that felt important in their own way. They stepped out into the same street Eleanor had just left, but for them, it was not something to observe from behind glass. It was something to walk through, to navigate step by step. Marcus held the door open for Caleb, then let it close behind them without looking back, because for him, there was nothing back there that needed to be revisited. The moment had already settled into its place, not as something to hold on to, but as something that had simply happened, and that was enough. A few blocks away, the car slowed again as they approached a building that stood taller than the rest, glass and steel reflecting the sky in sharp, controlled lines, the kind of place where decisions were made far from the sidewalks below. We are here, the driver said, pulling to a smooth stop. Eleanor did not move right away, her hand still resting against the door handle, her eyes lingering on her reflection in the window, composed, precise, unchanged on the surface. But she knew better now, not because anything had been said, but because something had been felt, and that was harder to dismiss. She stepped out, heels meeting the pavement with quiet confidence, the building rising in front of her like it always had, unchanged, unwavering. But as she walked toward the entrance, her pace slowed just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for her to feel it. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered not what she needed to do next, but what she had missed while doing everything else right. The lobby doors opened before she reached them, not because she asked, but because someone was always watching for her arrival, anticipating the moment she would step back into the version of herself the world understood. And as Eleanor Whitmore crossed the threshold, the air shifted again, cooler, controlled, carrying the quiet weight of expectation, heels moving across polished marble with a rhythm that had been learned over years, precise, unhesitating, each step a signal that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A receptionist glanced up, posture straightening instantly. Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore. The greeting delivered with practiced warmth, and Eleanor responded with a small nod, not slowing, not breaking stride. The elevator doors were already open, waiting, the interior lit softly, mirrors reflecting a version of her that felt familiar again, composed, distant, untouchable. She stepped inside, and as the doors closed, the city outside disappeared. Completely, replaced by a vertical ascent measured in numbers and silence, floor by floor, the world narrowing into something structured, something predictable. But even as the elevator moved, her mind did not settle back into its usual order. It lingered instead on something far less controlled. The way Marcus had turned back to his son without hesitation, without needing acknowledgement, as if that choice had always been clear, always been enough. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor. The doors opening to a hallway lined with glass and quiet authority, assistants moved with purpose. Voices low, screens glowing with information that never stopped updating. Her assistant, Caroline, approached immediately, tablet in hand, expression focused. You have a call with the board in 10 minutes, and the investors from Chicago are waiting on your approval for the revised terms, she said. Falling into step beside her, Eleanor listened, nodding slightly, absorbing each detail the way she always did, efficiently, without distraction. But today, there was a second layer beneath it, something that did not align neatly with schedules or projections, something that did not belong to this space. Move the call back 15 minutes, Eleanor said, her her voice steady, controlled, and Caroline blinked once, just enough to register the adjustment before nodding. Of course, she replied, already making the change. They reached the office doors, and Eleanor paused for the briefest moment before entering. Not enough to be noticed, just enough to feel the difference between stepping in and stepping away. Inside, the office was exactly as she had left it, clean lines, minimal distractions, a view of the city stretching out below like something she owned rather than something she moved through. She set her bag down on the desk, fingers resting lightly against the surface as if grounding herself in something solid, something known. Caroline continued speaking, outlining the next set of decisions. But Eleanor's attention shifted for a fraction of a second, just long enough to notice the absence of something, the absence of noise that had nothing to do with volume, the absence of that quiet presence she had felt earlier, and it left a space she had not expected. Is everything all right? Caroline asked, her tone careful, sensing the pause without understanding it. Eleanor looked up, her expression returning to its usual clarity. Yes, she said, and it was not untrue, just incomplete. Caroline nodded and stepped back, giving her space. The room settled into silence again, the kind that usually meant control, but today, it felt slightly different, less certain. Eleanor walked toward the window, looking out at the city below, cars moving like patterns, people reduced to motion, everything continuing as it always had. And yet, somewhere in that movement, there was a man who had stepped into a moment and then stepped out without carrying it with him. And for reasons she could not fully explain, that stayed with her, not as a disruption, but as a question, quiet, persistent. And for the first time in a long time, she did not reach for an immediate answer. The office settled into its usual rhythm within minutes, screens lighting up, voices filtering in through the glass walls, decisions stacking one after another in a quiet, relentless sequence, and Eleanor Whitmore stepped back into it with the same precision she always had, taking her seat, opening the first file, reviewing numbers that moved faster than most people could follow, her mind processing patterns, risks, outcomes, everything aligning the way it was supposed to, everything responding to her attention. But even as she worked, something beneath that surface remained untouched, a quiet thread she could not quite pull free. She signed one document, then another, her pen moving with practiced certainty, the kind that came from years of knowing exactly what mattered and what did not. And yet today, that certainty felt slightly thinner, not broken, just less absolute. Caroline entered again, placing a fresh set of reports on the desk. These are the updated projections, she said. And Eleanor nodded, flipping through the pages, numbers clean, margins tight, everything in order. Approve it, she said without hesitation, her voice steady. But as Caroline turned to leave, Eleanor spoke again, not louder, just enough to stop her. Caroline, she said, and the pause that followed was subtle, almost invisible. The cafe on 8th and Maple, she added, as if referencing something routine. Do we have any holdings in that area? Caroline blinked once, caught off guard not by the question itself, but by the fact that it had been asked. I can check, she replied, her tone shifting slightly, curiosity held in place by professionalism. Do you want a full report? Eleanor leaned back slightly, her gaze moving away from the documents for the first time since she had entered. No, she said after a moment. Just let me. No. Caroline nodded and left, the door closing softly behind her, and the room returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried a question now, one that had not existed in this space until today. Eleanor stood and walked back to the window, her reflection appearing faintly against the city beyond, composed, controlled, exactly as expected, but her eyes lingered a fraction longer than usual, as if searching for something that did not belong to this view, miles away. Marcus Reed pushed a shopping cart slowly down the grocery aisle, Caleb walking beside him, pointing at cereal boxes lined up in bright colors, each one louder than the last. Can we get this one? Caleb asked, holding up a box with a cartoon character smiling too wide. Marcus glanced at it, then at the price tag, then back at Caleb, not dismissing, not agreeing right away, just considering. How about we find one with less sugar? He said, his tone calm, not restrictive, just guiding. Caleb thought about it, then nodded, placing the box back and reaching for another, Smaller, simpler, they moved through the store that way. Decision by decision, nothing rushed, nothing wasted. At the checkout, Marcus counted bills carefully, not because he was unsure, but because every dollar had a place it needed to go. The cashier handed him the receipt, and he folded it neatly, tucking it into his pocket without looking at it again. Outside, the air had cooled slightly, the sky shifting toward evening. Caleb walked a few steps ahead, swinging a small bag in his hand, carefree in a way that only came from feeling safe. Marcus watched him, not constantly, not anxiously, just enough to know where he was, just enough to be there if needed. Back in the office, Eleanor returned to her desk, but instead of reaching for the next file, she sat still for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the surface, the city humming beyond the glass, the world continuing exactly as it should, and yet, somewhere between a cafe on a quiet street and a man who asked for nothing, something had entered her carefully ordered life without permission, and for the first time, she did not try to remove it. She let it remain, quiet, undefined, and somehow necessary. The evening settled slowly, not all at once, but in layers, the light outside Eleanor Whitmore's office dimming from sharp gold to a softer gray that reflected against the glass walls, stretching her reflection longer across the polished floor, the building itself quieting in subtle ways, fewer footsteps in the hallway, voices lowered, the energy shifting from urgency to endurance, and still, she remained at her desk, not because she had to, but because leaving too early would mean acknowledging that something had interrupted her rhythm, and she was not ready to define what that something was. Caroline knocked lightly before stepping in, holding a tablet close to her chest. "I checked the property records," she said, her tone neutral but observant. "The cafe on 8th and Maple is not under our portfolio, but the block it sits on is part of a redevelopment proposal we reviewed last quarter." Eleanor looked up, not surprised, but not entirely unaffected either. "And?" she asked, her voice steady. Caroline hesitated just slightly, choosing her words carefully. "The plan was to replace most of the small businesses in that area within the next year," she said, and the sentence settled into the room with more weight than it should have carried. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest, the information aligning easily with everything else she managed. Efficient, logical, profitable. The kind of decision she had approved countless times before without hesitation, but this time, something resisted, not loudly, not enough to disrupt, just enough to be noticed. "Put it on hold," she said after a moment. Caroline blinked, just once, the smallest fracture in her professional composure. "On hold?" she repeated, not questioning, just confirming. Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. "For now," she said, and Caroline wrote it down without further comment, though the silence that followed carried a quiet curiosity that would not be spoken aloud. When the door closed again, Eleanor exhaled. Softly, not a sigh, just a release of something she had not realized she was holding. Across the city, Marcus Reed unlocked the door to his apartment, the sound of the key turning soft but familiar. Caleb stepped inside first, dropping his backpack near the couch before kicking off his shoes with a kind of careless ease that came from knowing he was home. Marcus followed, setting the grocery bags on the small kitchen counter. The apartment modest, but clean, everything in its place, not because it had to be perfect, but because it was cared for. Caleb pulled out the cereal they had chosen, reading the back of the box out loud, as if it were more important than it was. Marcus listened, not correcting, not rushing him toward the next task, just letting the moment exist. "Can I pour it?" Caleb asked, holding up the box. Marcus nodded, stepping closer just enough to steady the bowl without taking over. The milk splashed slightly against the sides, a small mistake that neither of them treated as one. "That is good," Marcus said, and Caleb smiled, satisfied. Later, as the night settled deeper, Marcus sat at the small table with a stack of bills, not many, but enough to require attention. He reviewed them carefully, marking what was due, what could wait, his movements calm, deliberate. There was no frustration in the way he worked through them, just a quiet acceptance of what needed to be done. In the next room, Caleb's voice drifted softly, talking to himself as he built something out of blocks, the sound steady, reassuring. Back in her office, Eleanor stood by the window again, the city now lit by thousands of small lights, each one representing a life she did not see. decisions she did not track, and somewhere among them, a small apartment where a man had chosen to stand between discomfort and silence, not because it would change anything, but because it was the right thing to do. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, her reflection meeting her gaze once more, composed, unchanged, and yet, beneath that surface, something had shifted into place, not as a disruption, but as a quiet correction, and for the first time, the question was no longer what she had missed, but what she was willing to see now that she knew it was there. Morning arrived without asking whether either of them was ready for it. The light slipping through the edges of the city in a slow, deliberate way, touching glass towers first before finding its way down to sidewalks and windows that did not reflect it as cleanly. And in a small apartment across town, Marcus Reed was already awake, standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee that had not yet cooled. His movements quiet so as not to disturb the stillness that lingered in the early hours. Caleb slept in the next room, one arm draped over a blanket that had twisted sometime during the night, breathing steady, unaware of anything beyond the comfort of being safe. Marcus glanced at the clock, calculating the morning in small, manageable pieces: breakfast, school, work, each one fitting into place without needing to be forced. He moved through it the way he always did, not rushing, not delaying, just present. A few miles away, Eleanor Whitmore stood in front of a mirror that reflected more than her appearance, the room around her immaculate, untouched by anything that did not serve a purpose. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, the movement precise, practiced, the same way she had done it countless times before stepping into a day that demanded certainty. But today, there was a fraction of a pause, not visible to anyone else, just enough for her to notice that something in her routine had shifted, not in structure, but in meaning. She reached for her phone, then stopped, her hand hovering for a second before lowering again, choosing instead to stand in the quiet a moment longer. Downstairs, the car was already waiting, the driver positioned exactly as he had been the day before, the world prepared to move the moment she stepped into it. But Eleanor did not move immediately, her mind returning, not to a decision, but to a memory. The way Marcus had looked at his son when he thought no one was watching, the way his attention had not divided, had not been negotiated between what mattered and what could wait. It had simply known, and that certainty lingered with her in a way her own decisions never had. She finally stepped forward, leaving the room behind, the day unfolding as expected, meetings scheduled, calls lined up, responsibilities waiting. But as the car pulled into traffic, she spoke before the driver could ask. 8th and Maple, she said, her voice calm, but carrying something new. The driver glanced briefly in the mirror, surprised only for a second before nodding, adjusting the route without question. Back in the apartment, Marcus helped Caleb with his backpack, checking the zipper, making sure the folder was inside, small details that held larger meaning. You have your homework? He asked, and Caleb nodded, already thinking about the day ahead. Marcus opened the door, letting the morning air in, fresh, unfiltered, a contrast to the controlled environments that defined other parts of the city. They stepped outside together, walking down the block at a pace that did not need to be fast, because being on time was not the same as rushing. At the corner, Marcus stopped, kneeling slightly to meet Caleb at eye level. Listen to your teacher, he said, not as a command, but as a reminder. Caleb nodded, then smiled, that easy, unguarded smile that had not yet learned to be cautious. The school bus arrived a minute later, brakes hissing softly as it came to a stop. Caleb climbed on, turning once to wave, and Marcus lifted his hand in return, holding it there just a second longer than necessary, making sure the boy saw it, making sure he felt it. The bus pulled away, carrying Caleb into a day filled with things Marcus could not control, and he stood there for a moment after it was gone, not worrying, just acknowledging the space it left behind. Across the city, the car slowed as it approached a familiar corner, the cafe coming into view, unchanged, unremarkable to anyone who had never looked twice. Eleanor watched it through the window, her reflection faintly visible over the glass, and as the car came to a stop, she did not move right away, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this time, stepping out would not be part of her routine, it would be a choice. And for the first time in a long while, that distinction mattered. The engine idled softly beneath her, a steady hum that filled the space between decision and action. And Eleanor Whitmore sat in the back seat without moving, her hand resting lightly against the door handle, but not yet turning it. The cafe, just a few feet away, unchanged from the day before. The same windows catching the morning light. The same door that opened and closed without asking who entered or why. The driver waited without speaking, eyes forward, trained to hold silence the way others held conversation. And for a moment, everything paused, not because it had to, but because she allowed it to. She looked through the glass again, not searching this time, just observing. People moved in and out, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of movement she had spent years building systems around without ever stepping into it herself. And then she saw him, not immediately, not because he stood out, but because he did not. Marcus Reed sat at the same table, a cup in front of him, his posture the same as it had been before, steady, unguarded, present. There was no performance in the way he existed, no awareness of being watched. And that was what drew her attention more than anything else. He lifted his cup, took a sip, then set it down without reacting to the taste, as if the temperature did not matter, as if the moment was not about the coffee at all. Eleanor exhaled softly, a breath she did not realize she had been holding. And this time, when her hand moved, it did not stop. The door opened, the air outside meeting her without resistance. Cooler, real, unfiltered. She stepped out, heels touching the pavement with the same confidence as always. But the direction was different now, not toward a building that waited for her, but toward a place that did not. Inside. The bell above the door chimed again, the same sound as before, unnoticed by most. But she heard it clearly this time, as if it marked something she could not yet name. Marcus glanced up briefly, not startled, not expectant, just aware, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second before returning to the table, not dismissing, not inviting, simply allowing her presence to exist without needing to define it. She walked toward him, each step measured, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing. And when she reached the table, she did not sit immediately. She stood there, just for a moment, as if giving the space a chance to recognize her before she entered it again. "Good morning," she said, her voice softer than it would have been anywhere else. Marcus nodded once. "Morning," he replied, the words simple, unweighted. She pulled the chair out and sat, this time without asking, not out of assumption, but because something had already been understood between them. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried the same quiet presence as before, but now it felt shared. "You came back," he said after a moment, not as a question, just as an observation. Eleanor met his gaze, steady, composed, but different in a way that could not be measured. "I did," she replied, and for once, there was no reason attached to it, no explanation offered, just the truth, placed gently between them. Marcus nodded, accepting it without needing more. Outside, the city continued, unaware of the small shift taking place inside that cafe, unaware that something as simple as returning could carry more weight than leaving. Eleanor rested her hands lightly on the table, not reaching for anything, not offering anything, just present. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to sit in a moment that did not belong to her position, her title, or her world, but to something quieter, something that did not need to be owned to be understood. Marcus looked at her again, not analyzing, not measuring, just seeing. And in that space, without announcement, without change in status or circumstance, something settled into place, not dramatic, not visible, just real, the kind of shift that did not ask to be noticed, but once felt, could not be undone, and neither of them tried to name it, because they did not need to. Some things were stronger when left exactly as they were, unspoken, steady, and enough.